It is now time for a fireside chat between Mr. Rajat Gupta, Senior Partner McKinsey, and Dr. Satish Kumar, President and Executive Director, AEEE. The chat on investments and financing required for India to achieve its decarbonization goals. Since joining McKinsey in 1992, Mr. Gupta has been at the helm of various high-profile digital-first operational transformations. More recently, he is spearheading the sustainability practice of McKinsey in Asia. Mr. Gupta has helped set up India's national solar mission, and he's on the board of the Indian think tank C-STEP and the governing board of the Childline India Foundation. Prior to AEEE, Dr. Satish Kumar was the Energy Efficiency Ambassador and led the energy management business at Schneider Electric India. Dr. Kumar has served as a scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and the chief of party for a USAID-supported bilateral energy efficiency technical assistance project. He is a member on TEEP's Energy Efficiency Task Force under the Montreal Protocol. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, Akash. A very warm welcome to everybody in the audience for taking time out to come and join this feed event and support us in our decarbonization journey. Very good morning to Rajat. Rajat, pleasure to have you here. And I want to take this opportunity to just add to what Akash said. So Rajat, I was talking to Rajat and I reminded him that we have met about 15 years ago when they were working on energy efficiency. They were trying to understand demand side, and they were coming out with the McKinsey cost abatement curves for the greenhouse gas reductions. I was also reading Rajat's profile, and it says that he talks about Asia, climate action, sustainability, and decarbonization. So my mouth is watering, Rajat, because I think these are the things that we want to talk about. And also, I would mention that Rajat is one of the primary authors for Decarbonizing India. Some of you, I'm sure, have read that book. It's called Decarbonizing India, Charting a Pathway for Sustainable Growth. And during the course of the discussions, I'm sure we are going to hear some findings and also some insights from some of the things that did not make into the report, hopefully, through the questions and answers that we will have. So my first question, Rajat, is that we are all very happy, we are all excited to have you amidst us. Why should we change? Why should India or the global world needs to change? And why is decarbonization such an important lever for this transformation?
First, thank you very much, Satish, Chirag, and others for inviting me here. It's a delight to be amongst you today. I think the question that you raised, Satish, on why we should change is reasonably well answered, right? I mean, I think we should change for our grandchildren, right? So that piece is answered. To me, a more interesting question, which I'm going to turn this to, if you don't mind, is how should we change? And how is India different? I think the word that was used was the rebound effect a moment ago, right? And I want to touch a bit on that. And how is India different in its change journey on the path to decarbonization from the rest of the world? So maybe let me just touch on that aspect a little bit, and also touch a little bit on what you referred to as our first report on the topic of decarbonizing India. So the reason, we as McKinsey have done many of these decarbonizing Europe, decarbonizing America, decarbonizing India in the past type work. I think the thing that's different for India is precisely what we discussed 5 minutes ago in this room, which is that India is a growth economy. 75% of India of 2050 has not been built yet. Industrial capacities haven't been built. The cars on the roads are not there. Perhaps more of the roads have been built, but they haven't been widened enough. So the road capacity hasn't been built. The houses haven't been built. the electrical equipment isn't there yet, right, of what India will be. This is not true of Europe. It's a little bit somewhat true of the US, which is still in a growth mode. And when we talk about decarbonizing those markets, it's a lot about taking installed base and restructuring that installed base. I think we are different in that way. We are going to be about taking our new base, which is going to come up, and building it right. We are not going to, I mean, it's not either or, right? It's necessary for us to think hard about the installed base. But a lot more of our thinking, a lot more of our energy has to go into the energy efficiency or the carbon efficiency of the new base that we will build. Right? That is an opportunity for us. Right? And again, this is not unknown. This is well known. Maybe let me just make one more point to contrast our new report, which is here, and I'll leave you a copy of this. When we did this work in 2009, 2010 for India, there's a very different world. The world, and we were looking at this very differently. We were saying, what's the best effort decarbonizing? We were looking 20 years out, 2030 at that time. What's the best effort decarbonization that India can achieve? Right? And the MAC curve, not McKinsey curve, it's the MAC curve, marginal abatement cost curve, though it was invented by a couple of colleagues of mine, which you referred to also. We were able to write that out pretty clearly when we said, okay, what's the best effort decarbonization India can do by 2030? So you kind of say what's the business as usual, and you kind of put a bunch of largely energy efficiency, new energy levers on it, and you were able to come up with a view. When we did this with a different aspiration in mind. India had announced 2070 net zero, rest of the world had announced, most of it announced 2050 net zero, and we were saying now, not what's the best effort to net zero, or what's the best effort to decarbonization, but what's the full effort to net zero, which by the way we don't get to in this report. In neither of our scenarios we get to that. We don't, of course things will change, it will actually happen I believe at some point of time, but we weren't able to assess how. So now with this mindset, it becomes even more important, right? You can't really look at the installed base of 25% of what India will be in 2050 only, right? You have to look at the new base much more aggressively, and the main point I'll make, which is also captured in this report, and we'll come back to some aspects of that as we go along, I hope, in this conversation, is that we need to act now, in this next 1, 2, 3 years, to be able to get the investment that will come in the next this decade's investment pretty much done. You look at steel, it's going to come on the coal route for the most part, a little bit will come on the scrap route. You look at cement, you know, companies are investing. They've made their investment plans already. Now, what can we do today that will make sure that the investment plans or the investment that comes into the ground in 2031 and all the way through the next decade, 2 decades after that, comes in the right way, in the energy efficient and the carbon efficient way?
So, Rajat, thank you for that opening remark. You know, you have heard that AEEE works in the area of energy efficiency. And what I'm also thinking of doing this fireside chat with is that your report talks about the broad decarbonizing levers that I think India will need to act on. And then you heard Dr. Mathur and Chirag mention that what are some of the historical barriers that energy efficiency in terms of attracting investment has faced. So when you talk about the marginal abatement curve, and you talked about that some of the lighting and the appliances and the building retrofits, they had negative marginal abatement curves. And at that point of time, solar was still considered very expensive, and solar prices have plummeted after this. So in terms of when you are making the projections, one of the things that we saw in this report, that the final energy consumption, which is where I think all this infrastructure that is getting built, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's solar, whether it's hydrogen, that's going to get used, whether we are cooling our building, whether we are heating our building or lighting up our building. And this has a larger systemic implications because your peak demand, how that is going to play out, is going to play a very, very important role. So I'm picking up on the theme that Dr. Mathur mentioned, that we need to have this, either this twinning strategy or a troika of approaches where efficiency, renewable, and storage, they all need to work in harmony. So I would like that maybe perhaps you can share that when you are thinking about the decarbonization approach for India, what in your thought is something that needs to happen? Because we always see that the investment as opposed to renewables and storage is a little lower. So what in your opinion is the reason for that? And perhaps I think some of the points that Dr. Mathur mentioned. So from your vantage point, how do you see we should be approaching, and people in the room should be approaching this?
I think the one takeaway, which I kind of had in my mind when I came in, but has got reinforced by Dr. Mathur, some of Chirag's comments, is that we cannot look at energy efficiency anymore in isolation. Right? So when I'll refer back to 12 years ago when I did the same equivalent for India's pathway, on the marginal abatement cost curve, which is levers and cumulative abatement carbon-wise and equivalently energy-wise, half of that curve, because we had a very small aspiration, what's the best we can do, half of that curve was negative value or positive NPV actions. And those could be done in isolation in some ways, right? By the way, there was also a lot of low-hanging fruit. There were opportunities in the installed base of industry, of automotive, of appliances at home, which could be changed. And by the way, it's not like all low-hanging fruit are gone, and low-hanging fruit keep coming as technology advances, but it was easier. Now, if I look at it, if I draw up the marginal abatement cost curve with the full potential to take 2.5 tons per ton of steel, for example, and I draw a marginal abatement cost curve for that, and I put it on a put it on a marginal abatement cost curve. Only about 10 to 15% of the actions, first and foremost, are energy efficiency related. Some of them become change of fuel, but even those are positive cost. But you have to, because you're trying to abate 80 to 100% of what's out there, right? And the costs are all many more on the right side, and so therefore need much more development on the technology front on the one hand, and much more development on the regulatory front. Because again, I'll come back to something that Chirag, you said, and Dr. Mathur talked about. This is not going to be about finding lower cost financing. It's about taking those projects and making sure they get to be in the money. And let me give you one example of something that has to happen, right? So, and it's a combination of technology and regulations which are going to make projects come in the money. So let's take steel. We make about 120 million tons of steel today. We'll make 3-4x as much in 30 years from now to 2050. Now, most of this steel will be made, or most of this new capacity that will come up will come on the carbon route as things stand, right? We expect hydrogen costs will go down from $4 or $5 to $2 in a country like India, maybe less than that. But even so, the capacities that are likely to come will be potentially some scrap, which of course India will have limited scrap. India is building itself. It's not churning out scrap like China will. So therefore, most of the capacities will come on the carbon coking coal blast furnace current routes. One shift, which is if we can indicate a $50, it's an important demand signal. If we can indicate a $50 carbon price today, meaning in the next year or two, in 2030, hydrogen-based steel making and a $2 hydrogen plus a $50 carbon price becomes competitive relative to coal-based steel making. 150 million tons of steel-based capacity, $150 billion of potential investment, which would come otherwise on the coal-based route, can now shift potentially, not all of it will happen, but potentially onto the hydrogen-based route, right? So therefore, this again reinforces the point on the kind of work that needs to happen today for these ideas to get into the money. This is obviously at an economy level, what it means is it's carbon efficiency and energy efficiency, because we will now be using the sun to make steel, to make this important material which is needed for building our nation. So the idea of making financing work also has to be around making these big ideas come into the money. Once these ideas are in the money, of course instruments are needed, risk has to be reduced, foreign exchange risk has to be less. All of those finer points will only become relevant when the big idea comes into the money. And by the way, there are places where big ideas are in the money, somewhat intended, like in the case of renewables, and in some places unintended, like in the case of EVs in India. If you give me an opportunity and ask me the right question, I'll give you a secret on that one.
Thanks, Rajat. So I think the point that you are making, and I think what I am picking up on that is that a lot of the business and investment community is looking at big ideas which will move the needle towards, I think, a faster decarbonization, and the steel example that you are giving and that impact. I'm just taking a step back, and I'm looking at India's kind of like total final energy consumption, which is about 600 million tons of oil equivalent. And if we look at, I think in your report as well, and then in IEA's report, then we are saying that in 2040, this number will, if we don't do anything on the demand side, then this number will grow to about 1500, 2.5x growth, because we all are talking about that India is a growth economy. With the help of the demand side interventions, together with all the things that we will do with the cement and the steel and the power sector, we are talking about 400 million tons of oil equivalent actually reducing the demand. So this point that Prasad mentioned about the rebound effect, we will see the energy consumption go up. That's inevitably going to happen. But if you look at the Ministry of Power setting a target of 150 million tons of oil equivalent reduction by 2030, that is equivalent cumulatively to about output from 400 power plants. So the challenge, in my opinion, and all of us I think who work in that sector, is how to make these small numbers, whether it's coming from the buildings or appliances or mobility and others, stack up in a way where they start to see that actually if you have the right business model, if you have the right financing model, there is a pretty big pie that we should be targeting. And that's something that I believe, I think from the vantage point that we are working on, is a very, very significant undertaking and a significant goal to accomplish. So just wanted, I think, your opinion, and before we move on to some of the other areas, that when we are trying to do this supply and demand balancing, we always seem to come up a little bit short in terms of what is the potential and what is the reality.
So before we answer, let me ask you a question back. Let's take that, let's sort of deep dive into this 400 million MTOE potential for reduction from the IEA. Can you just define, just from memory roughly, what are the 3 or 4 major sectors? And then let's talk about each of those sectors in turn and what needs to be done in those.
Right, so I think the way IEA defines all the energy efficiency sort of related savings that we are talking about. So one is the technical efficiency that we are talking about. So it's fuel efficiency improvements, it's cooling efficiency, we have...
Sorry to interrupt, but maybe if you can help me by just saying it by sector. So, of course, fuel efficiency pretty much means automotive.
Right,
is that what?
Right.
So automotive is one sector.
Automotive is one sector. Buildings, we can talk about lighting. LED has already shown that in India, about probably 10 to 12 gigawatts of generation offset has happened because of the LED adoption. And we are talking about fans, we are talking about cooling appliances like more efficient, probably 2 or 3x more efficient room air conditioners, those kind of. So that can be in the building sector. In industry sector, which is, I think, so we can talk about improved furnaces, we can talk about electrification. So this is another thing, how IEA deals with energy efficiency. It doesn't say that electrification is just a separate thing. It brings electrification within the ambit of efficiency, because ultimately the power consumption, energy consumption is going down because of that fuel switching that is happening. And then in the agricultural sector, there are a lot of food losses that are happening, which can actually be controlled through cold chains and which can be renewable energy power. Dr. Mathur alluded to that. We have Mr. Ravi Purushothaman from Danfoss, who is working with the industry a lot in these areas. So these are, I'm just giving some examples in terms of, now ESCOs we talked about, like how much ESCO can be scaled up, and they can work in the industrial sector, they can work in the MSME sector, they can work in the building sector. So the question question about, I think, what can demand side do to scale up at this thing. And that is the challenge, because transaction costs are high, ticket sizes are low, so we are talking about risk mitigation mechanism. So I hope that I'm answering your question.
And asking me a tough one.
Right.
So look, let's take each of these. You've identified automotive, buildings, industry, electrification, and agri as sectors, right? Let's take each of these and get a bit deep into the question that you raised around the demand side actions, or actions, I might say, because to me it's a bit hard to say what's demand, what's supply, because one man's demand is another man's supply, or woman's supply. So let's take each of these sectors and maybe take a little bit of a comprehensive view on them. And I'll ask you about one or two of these sectors, since I hope this is a fireside chat, that's two ways. Okay, let's take automotive to start with, right? I think there is, of course, a huge potential in the ICE engine, the internal combustion engine, to be much more efficient, no doubt about it.
Perhaps hybrid, combining it with hybrid.
There are, of course, hybrids, and our Japanese colleagues from the automotive industry have done a lot of work on those areas and so on. But let me throw out one fact which I was shocked by, and maybe I'll ask you a question on that one, right? So India, of course, taxes its fuels, transportation fuels, quite highly, right? And if you said that, look, let's apply a reasonable level of taxation, you can apply 5% electricity duty equivalent, or you can apply 16, 17% appropriate level of GST equivalent, and you took the excess taxation and converted it into an implicit carbon price. Can you tell me, can you guess, or you may know you do a lot of this work, can you tell me how would this translate into a dollars per ton as an implicit carbon price?
I may not be able to convert that, but I know that in your report you have talked about the loss of revenue to the government because of this transition. And I'm just probably hazarding a guess, I don't know, $25?
It's $140 to $240 a ton. And many of you will know today, EU ETS, the energy trading scheme, is at $80 or thereabouts. Right? We are at 2x, 3x that. Now, you also know what happened 2 weeks ago in the Automotive Expo. 80% of the discussion was on non-ICE. There was hybrids, there were battery electric vehicles, and you also know that if you look at the press, the two-wheeler discussion is all, whether it's fires or accidents or it's new products, it's all about new products in the battery electric space.
So it's good. I mean, it's good for efficiency also, right? Through this transition, I mean, two-wheeler, three-wheelers are growing at probably 100, 150 year over year. I mean, passenger vehicle maybe like another 5, 10 years will start to grow.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So, you know, this is a huge force. Of course, there's the FAME subsidies, there is a bunch of other things that are out there which are also leading. But today, a two-wheeler EV two-wheeler is half, from a life cycle perspective, is half the cost of ICE engine vehicle. And of course, the issue here is that there aren't enough products, the products may not be safe, the capital cost of this is higher despite the FAME subsidies that might be available. And so therefore, how does the middle class man or woman buy that two-wheeler, or how do they get financed to buy that two-wheeler, right? So now, if you look at it, it's an efficiency measure in a broader economic sense. It is something that has clear tailwinds behind it. The FAME subsidies, the $240 or take your pick, $140 carbon tax, that's sort of propelling it. There's a whole bunch of entrepreneurs, including established conglomerates or established companies that make two-wheelers, who are diving into that space. There's a timeline by which four-wheelers become competitive, light commercial vehicle becomes competitive. Heavy commercial vehicles, not as much line of sight, maybe they do, in a 15-year time frame, maybe with slightly different technologies than just pure battery electric. So there's a time frame to that. Now the question here is, what are all the things that we can do to rebuild, not rebuild, accelerate this momentum, at least at a minimum maintain this momentum, so that by 2030, most of what's being sold on our roads is in some ways electrified on the back of course, a greener and greener grid. And so the rebound effect also counts here, because it's not a rebound effect exactly, but it's the fact that if you use a dirty grid, then you do have a high carbon mobility solution still. So, I mean, that's my question back, right? What can we do to maintain this momentum? We've built a momentum unintentionally, intentionally.
So I think it's the auto example. I just want to give a couple of examples from the building industry, okay? So the building industry, if you look at right now, and if you look at these numbers, the average per unit area energy consumption that we are talking about is about, say, 150 to 175 kilowatt hour per unit area per year. We have examples from industry, like Infosys, which has about 55 million square feet of space. They are running their facility at 70 kilowatt hour, 50% reduction, just through design, through the choice of materials, through more efficient appliance technology, some of the things that we are discussing. And they are going to go to net zero by producing the delta on site through solar or procuring green power. So some of these things has been done in India and has been done at a very minimal cost. Some people say that, oh, that's going to cost 15-20% more. And Infosys is saying that we didn't pay a dime more than, I think, our normal buildings, I think, the way they were constructed 10-15 years ago. So I think a lot of us also believe that through the design, through the operation, through the system design approach, a lot of these things can come down. Because if we just keep focusing that, okay, we can design, we can do more power generation through renewables, or we can go for just more efficiency, then we are going to lose out on some of these things. So I just wanted to bring that into picture in terms of like why we feel that all these components need to be at play here.
No, so I think the integrative element of this, I think it's again being reinforced in what you said, right? It's not either or. It's not just greening the grid, but it's simultaneously greening the vehicle on the road. It's not just greening the grid, but it's also creating additional supply of green energy, but it's also Infosys reducing its energy intensity, in a sense, per square foot. But let me just segue from this thing into the third one, which is the industry one, right? So if you look at buildings, the largest part of a building's emission, right, and in some ways energy, perhaps is not in the life cycle of use. It is in the steel and cement that goes into it. Now, I haven't done the numbers, so I'm making an estimate here. Somebody here may have done the numbers and maybe can tell us what they are, but I'm...
In India, it is about like, for commercial buildings, it becomes much bigger, the operational side. But for residential buildings, because we don't have that high penetration of appliances, so embodied carbon, which is where the steel and cement are going to come in, is going to take a significant chunk. But in Western world, people have not paid attention to this because they say 80% of our carbon impact of buildings is operational energy. So everybody just focuses on operational energy, and we are trying to revisit this issue. So just for you.
So look, this is great, right? So of course, I mean, this is again the point about it's not either or, right? So you have to focus on the building energy efficiency with all the kinds of measures that you talked about. But let's shift to the industrial side of this, and steel and cement is the obvious ones, right? These are the two, along with chemicals and refining, these are the three industries that put out the most carbon into the atmosphere, and therefore, they put that out because they are the most energy intensive industries. So let's get to steel and cement. A couple of reflections to how do we get to both decarbonized as well as more efficient in many ways steel and cement industries. Steel I talked about, right? We can electrify steel. Effectively, if we can make steel with hydrogen, if we can make steel with more of our scrap or reused steel, that's a very large source of energy efficiency at a national level, because that energy, if it comes from green sources, then it obviously comes straight from the sun. It's more efficient in many ways, right? It's certainly more carbon efficient. Let's take another couple of examples there, and I don't know where it kind of fits. Does it fit into energy efficiency? Does it fit into alternate fuel source or whatever? And this particularly applies to the installed base of steel and all of the base of cement that's likely to come. Cement is incredibly hard to decarbonize. 1/3 of the emissions that cement comes out with are process emissions. Calcium carbonate becoming calcium oxide, right? Carbon dioxide has to come into the atmosphere. 2/3 of it is heating of some sort or reduction energy. Now, there are very few alternatives, at least in steel we talked about scrap and hydrogen-based steel making. There are alternatives of that nature. There's even electrolysis being talked about for steel. So again, electrification. But in cement, there doesn't seem to be any significant electrification in sight. So let me connect this to our fourth sector, which we should also come back to agri sector, right? So what should we do with our biomass, therefore? Should we be pushing our biomass as a nation into boilers? We have to put a certain amount of our biomass back into the earth for local sequestration. I think that is an essential and first use of biomass that should be there. But should we be taking our biomass and pushing it into boilers where electrification is more feasible? Or should we be taking that biomass, appropriately beneficiating it, putting it into our cement kilns? Right? And likewise, let me take another element of biomass. I'll now go back a little bit and connect it to mobility. Should we take our agricultural produce and biomass, make biofuels for cars, which can get electrified otherwise? Or should we take that, and by the way also municipal waste, and should we convert and create industrial facilities to make sustainable aviation fuel, for which batteries and electrification is so far out while it's being talked about and the first plane has flown, but at mass scale it's so far out and so unforeseeable? Or should we be diverting all of those sources of, or all of those natural resources that we have, some of them are waste streams, into areas which are harder to decarbonize? And likewise, by the way, you could also put biomass into blast furnaces to replace coking coal today. Right? That's of course the installed base decarbonization. So I think these are some of the other ideas that we as a nation, and they are tightly tied to creating the right demand signals. We need a blending mandate. I mean, it will cost more probably, and the cement that comes out will be more expensive if we are using biomass because the supply chains haven't quite been established, right? So we do need either a carbon price, maybe a $50 carbon price may suffice, $70 carbon price may suffice, or we need a blending mandate. At the level of the cement, the X% of our cement that has to be applied in our buildings has to be green cement. Or we need a buying mandate, which is different for the cement makers, to say that 20% of the energy that you buy has to be green energy in this form, fuels that you buy. So we need a combination of these kinds of measures which are decarbonizing these large emitting sectors. And by the way, these are the sectors which are going to grow tremendously in a growing India.
So couple of points there, and I think on the carbon pricing I will come back because we have to discuss a little bit, I think, more on that piece. But this biomass issue is also very interesting because, I mean, India has put a lot of emphasis on rural electrification and on removing the biomass usage in the rural homes through the use of gas cylinders and through the PAHAL scheme. And I was reading that the total investment that the country has made is about 23,000 crores actually on this thing. So that's a pretty sizable number. And together with what you are saying, that is there an alternative pathway to channel some of these biomass for decarbonizing, whether it's steel or whether it's electricity generation? I mean, we probably need to keep into account that what's the calorific value of the biomass and how much carbon dioxide is going to come if we burn that, and I think what's the black carbon effect that is going to be happening. But biomass, in my opinion, remains probably a low-hanging fruit and maybe a ripe area for technological interventions if we can get the supply chain issue resolved to move the worst use, which is kind of the boiling water and the cooking, and two, I think, is some of the more organized sector where these things can be done. So that's a very, very good point that you are making, Rajat, and thank you for doing that. I just want to come back to the report, and you mentioned about the electric vehicle, and you said that I would like to elaborate upon that. I will just say that AEEE, we are working with Ministry of Power and Bureau of Energy Efficiency on the demand side measures for buildings, industry, and transport. And in the transport sector, we said that in some way fuel efficiency standards are passé, right? Because you have this EV technology, which is everybody is talking about, and sooner or later India is already, I think, turning over to stock in 2- and 3-wheelers, and probably I think in buses also, and 4-wheelers will follow suit, I think, as the prices keep coming down. But there is still a legacy issue of CAFE standards and other things that while we are talking to policymakers, they are saying, no, we cannot really talk openly about electric vehicles because India cannot afford the four-wheelers and other things right now. So I would like that what are the data points that you want to touch upon from your report, which will kind of make it more compelling that what are the key intervention points that we should be focusing on, not just from technology and financing perspective, but also from policy making perspective. You referred to FAME. The money that is being allocated to FAME is really small. I mean, if you look at the challenge that we are looking at. So maybe policy, technology, and financing. All those three elements, how do you think the automotive industry is actually going to adapt?
Maybe I'll respond to this in a wider frame than the automotive industry only. I think the point you make about moving to Euro 6, for example, upgrading our refineries appropriately, the engine had to be upgraded also, right? And the investment that went in there, at what point does it become infructuous because an alternate technology takes it on, right? I think
this is something that happened with CFLs. People invested in CFLs and the life cycle calculation was for 10, 15 years. And within 3 or 4 years, LED came and CFL kind of went out. So it's exactly.
And by the way, some of this will happen. The march of technology is infinite in some ways, and who knows which piece of technology will break through and move beyond, right? So some of this will happen. We should expect it, and there will be assets that go stranded as a result, right? The CFL bulb in my home, for example. But I think to me, more important, back to the policy question and financing questions and so on, and there are several that we've touched on in our report, but I'll touch on 2 or 3 that are important here. I think this revolution that we are seeing on investment in sustainability is worth trillions of dollars and hundreds of billions of dollars even at a national level like India in terms of the investments that have to be made, right? The last revolution that we've seen in our business life has been the digital revolution, right, in the last 10 years. And for the most part, that's been tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. And therefore, the idea of agile, let's learn, let's do this, let's do that, we can change the path that we are following in, has become very fashionable. I don't think that can be the exact path for this revolution. Because the fact of the matter is that industry, governments, maybe even to some extent individuals in their cars and so on, have to invest in hundreds of billions, tens of billions. And these investments will not come unless there's certainty of making money for certain businesses, right? And even for individuals. And so I think it behooves us as a nation to take a 20, 30 year out view, like we described what could happen, what could be an alternate pathway for steel. Roll back the future, have a 25-year plan, have a 15-year plan, have a 5-year plan, and say that what actions do we need to do today to make a future that's 25 years out possible, right? And you know, I said, look, in the next 2 to 3 years, if we can indicate a carbon price in some way, shape or form through the compliance carbon markets that the Bureau of Energy Efficiency is working on, if we can create clear policies so that steelmakers tomorrow onwards can start engineering a hydrogen-based steel plant at scale for installation by 2031, right? Great for our nation. So I think a long-term plan which has actions that are true today that you can make today, which then lead to some steadiness in policies. Like we said, they can't be 100% steady because the march of technology will be the march of technology. But maybe with some allowance for assets that go stranded, I mean, to sort of, you know, come out of the difficulties that they put themselves into. I think this is certainly one thing that's needed. And if I just go back a little bit to the history, this is what happened in some ways in our renewable sector. So I had the good fortune to work with Mr. Shamsaran on the solar mission in 2009-10 at that time. It got set up in a reasonably agile and flexible way. A whole host of policies that came into place, including the initial one of blending the power with NTPC's excess power. So therefore, to bring the cost of the blended power down, the 16 rupee power that was bought, it was of course bought in small quantities, blended with coal-based power. The creation at some point of time of SECI, right? And the institutional mechanisms for us to add 8 to 10 gigawatts of renewable capacity today and hopefully 40, 50 gigawatts of renewable capacities to meet our NDC, right? So we've been through that journey where through some hand, a set of policies, even in a uncertainty of technology evolution, there was, remember, at that time, CSP would win or PV would win, for example, right? There was a question. PV eventually did win, at least for the last 10 years and then maybe the next 10. And so I think the steadiness of having a national vision on this, the policies that come into place, is one very important enabler. And this is true for automotive, it will be true for steel, it will be true for cement, it will be true for the use of our biomass. It will be used whether we in advance have excess sustainable aviation fuel, then our market will support and export it and use that to build the industrial base for sustainable aviation fuel, so that 10, 15 years from now we can divert it for our own use in India, right? So I think it's sector after sector having that view, and it has to be a reasonably bottom-up view, is important. Right. By the way, there are other sets of actions we need, and I'm not going to expand on those, but I'll just seed those thoughts. We need a land mission and a land plan. Because of all of what we need to do, including electrification, we'll be 15% land short in our country. Electrification, natural carbon solutions, biomass for the use of hard-to-abate sectors.
US, so yeah.
Right? We'll be 15% land short, even though we are a very productive land resource country. Right? We will need a carbon price, right? And Bureau of Energy Efficiency is already working on it, but are they working with a target carbon price in mind or not? Right? So a whole host of things that have to be done from a policy perspective.
So I'm getting signals to sort of like start wrapping up, and I want to have 2 or 3 questions, but my last 2 questions, and maybe we can have a short answer, is that risk is what we don't see, what we are not planning for, and we are not talking about, right? So in terms of, again, I think I'm just going to ask that how much financing, because all of us are talking about financing and investments. So what is the scale of financing that you believe is going to be required to mitigate the challenge? I think this climate challenge, the mother of all challenges that we are facing. So can you give us some ballpark numbers in terms of, I think, what's the scale at which we are looking for decarbonization?
Yeah. Overall, for decarbonization, our assessment in the report we've identified is about 4 to 6.5% of economy, depending on which scenario you follow. You know, we have 2 scenarios in this report, one that gets closer to net zero by 2050, another one by 2070. None of them get all the way there, unfortunately. So it's about somewhere between 4 to 6.5% of the GDP. Okay. Put this in context, we invest somewhere between 25 and 35%, depending on the year, into our economy. A lot of that is actually housing stock that gets built up, or real estate, not housing stock only, all of real estate. A fair amount is government expenditure into capital expenditure, which has actually interestingly gone up in yesterday's budget, which is great. So I think that's the magnitude. It translates to, in total, 7 to about $12 trillion from 2020 to 2050.
Okay.
The breakup of this number is about a third in mobility, a third in electricity supply, and a third in industry, natural climate solution, agriculture, those other areas. If you put a gun to my head and said how much of this is energy efficiency related or demand side related, it's something, I mean, I might venture a guess of half. But to me, again, I think this has now become an integral problem. These can't be problems that can be solved in isolation.
Okay. I think there are lots of business people here, and I know that McKinsey works very closely with business, and we have also seen that the public side of investment, you talked about $7 to $12 trillion, very large number, and not all of that will be made by government, right? It has to be like through blended financing and public-private partnership. So if we are talking about leveraging the public investment, and sometimes 1:3 or 1:5 numbers are thrown at, what is your message for the businesses? I think as they embark on the decarbonization journey, and not only they want to survive, but they want to thrive in that. So what's your message to the business?
I mean, I have a very simple message, right? So I think we can all play a defensive game and look at all the efficiency measures in our plants and factories and so on. We should, that's necessary. It's must have, but not sufficient. I think this is the biggest opportunity of our lifetime, and maybe even of the last century. What we are seeing come ahead is the largest capital reallocation that the world has seen, probably after the Second World War, probably after the industrial, potentially even after the industrial revolution, the largest reallocation of capital that the world has seen. And the signals of that, and whether we get to net zero or not, or whether we get there in 2040, 2050, 2100, unfortunately, hopefully it's sooner, for at least our grandchildren sake. Whether we get there or not, the revolution has started. The investment has started. And so therefore my main message to business is look for green businesses. And by the way, many of you are doing it, right? I mean, many of you have electrification equipment, right? And you're surely looking at that and saying, how can we grow that? How can we get into newer areas like electrolysis or electrolytic equipment or anodes and cathode manufacturing and so on. I'm sure all of you are doing that. We did a small analysis, which is not in this report, and we looked at 10 companies in sectors, predominantly in sectors that had already moved on the path to decarbonization, largely electrical, but also fuels. Neste, Enel, E.ON, these kinds of companies. And we looked at 10 other companies that had either not embarked on that path, or the sectors themselves are a little bit behind, steel companies, cement companies. And we found that the market to book for the first set of companies was 4.5. The market to book of the second set of companies was 1.5. Now, what's the difference? 3x difference, right? So any dollar that you invest in growth behind the green is giving you 3x the return of any dollar that you invest in equipment and so on behind the gray, right? That's what this at least was my takeaway. And so, and particularly for you here, right? You are the providers of the spades for the gold miners, right? The gold miners may or may not make money in this, right? In the Californian boom as it happened, right? But the spade makers will. So you have the biggest opportunity here to be the spade makers. You will make money and you will create large valuation opportunities here. So look at the opportunity side of this equation. While you look at efficiency and so on in your own plants and operations, it's a must-have, it's a must-do, but this is a huge value creation opportunity that's coming up.
So, thank you, Rajat. I will end up our kind of bilateral discussion with a quote, and which I particularly like it. So, fire can be used to warm ourselves on a cold night, but it can also be used to burn down the house. The same is true of electricity and nuclear energy, what we are talking today. Making energy available for human use is an important accomplishment, but learning how to use this energy well is at least as essential. And this is a quote by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He has a book called Finding Flow. I particularly like it. So thank you, Rajat, for, I think, wonderful insights and your thoughts on decarbonizing. What are the levers? What is the amount of financing needed? How energy efficiency, renewable energy storage, all of these need to work together. I do want to be receptive to the audience. Maybe I think I will probably take 2 or 3 questions for you so that I think they have the privilege of interacting with you. I will request people to be very, very brief, to the point. Please do not provide any comment. Just ask a question because we are running behind time, and let Rajat respond to the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm A.K. Jain. I'm from the urban sector and also involved with the architecture and building sector. Very comprehensive talk, and I think Mr. Rajat Gupta gave very, very detailed answers. And you have touched everything on energy efficiency, carbon neutral economy, the industry, agriculture, mobility, etc., etc. But 2 things I think need to be emphasized here, which I think...
Sir, can you please come to the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So the 2 areas which I think are of concern is, one is digitization in the blockchain system of supply chain, because this is very important. We are losing a lot of electricity in the supply chain system. And the second is the storage of the electricity. Once we talk of renewables, etc., without storage is not easy.
So digitization and storage. And what is the question?
Question means what is the status,
what is the thought?
how it relates with the...
Rajat? Okay, I think let's do that, and yeah, that would be a good idea. Yeah, Shailendra?
Yeah, hi, my name is Shailendra. Can you hear me?
Maybe I think, yeah.
I'm Shailendra Mutkal from Bio Innovation Service, and I advise mostly European Union on these issues. And I think from a decarbonization perspective, I think one aspect which I thought was missing was circular economy angle. In particular, when I take the building sector, where the construction and demolition waste in Europe is more than 90%, which is not recycled or reused, because it's very labor intensive. But I was wondering if India, this can be done, because I think all the embodied carbon in the building sector, 90% goes in the material, and if that could be recycled, because we have the manpower to do it, and I think we could do things differently compared to Europe or the US.
I think perhaps scrap we talked about. Yeah.
Okay, all right. One more question. Prabhatji, yeah.
So a question straight off from the cooling sector, which is definitely one of the large energy consumers. And it might be a follow-up question to my last question in your last conference. There was a great effort to bring out evaporative cooling based small air conditioners. That means energy efficient air conditioners. And it forms a great part of your India Cooling Action Plan. Have been trying to follow this up through a lot of LinkedIn posts and things like that, leading to no answers till date. Whatever happened to that? I'm to say, are we going to get the product in the market? Number one. Number two, did that stop because of fear of failure or lack of investment? Thank you.
Okay, the last question I'll defer to Satish. I don't know enough about the cooling sector by itself. So maybe I'll just take and thank you for those questions. I think there were a couple of points that I would love to communicate. You've given me the opportunity to do that. I think to the question on storage of power, I think critically important. The supply into the grid is becoming more and more infirm. The renewable by its very nature is infirm as a source of power, and I think also demand is becoming more infirm and uncertain. As the sources of demand are expanding, whether it's mobility as a source of demand or it's steel making as a potential source of demand at some later point of time for electricity. So you're absolutely right. Storage is an important interface issue. I think Ajay touched on that quite extensively, and he said that there's no energy efficiency, there are no renewables without storage. By the way, digitization also applies here, right? Without very, very close digitization, not only in the supply chains, but in the way we manage our electricity grid, we're not going to be successful. Let me bring out one point linked to this, right? And by the way, our report also does cover various elements and means of storage. Battery is not the only way. I talked about $2.5 trillion of investment that's needed in our electricity grid and generation for this journey to happen towards net zero for India. About 10% of that capital expenditure can be reduced by just market reform, by just utilizing the opportunities for flexibility that are existing in the grid. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. Today, for example, coal plants are cycling already and are being used to stabilize the grid and provide firm power. A lot of our hydropower is tied, right? Whatever 30 gigawatts of hydropower that we have, and maybe 30, 50 gigawatts that we will create, run of the river, some may be pumped hydro also. A lot of it is going to be tied, only very little of it is used for stabilization of the grid or to make infirm power firm, right? If we made that different, if we came out of those PPAs, created market reform, ensured pricing of that electricity in an appropriate way, that electricity is worth 13, 14 rupees a unit to us, right? Because what's the alternative? Gas-based generation. What's the alternative? Battery, 20 rupees in today's day and age. So instead of selling that for 2 rupees, if we were able to sell that electricity at appropriate points of time for 5, 6, 7 rupees, right? So market reform on that, freeing up the PPAs on that front. And many such other ideas in the large grid that we've created, in the very big infrastructure that we've created. Likewise for cycling coal, right? Of course, batteries too, right? For the last 2% of stabilization that's needed. If we were able to do that, there's $250 billion of savings as far as capital expenditure is concerned, 10% of our total capital expenditure in the grid. And by the way, in that are ideas for the equipment providers like yourselves. So I think that's the answer to the first set of questions, digitization and storage. On the circular economy, I think we did spend time on it. The one point I'll make again is that I was shocked to find that between our, what we call line and sight scenario and our accelerated, the 2070 to net zero equivalent and 2050 net zero equivalent, second largest lever after renewable electricity is actually the circular economy. And a large part of that is metals recycling. Some part of that is construction and demolition waste, the concrete side of it, not just the metal side of it, because it includes both. And then, of course, there's the agri-waste and the recycling of that. And then, of course, you know, to enable this economy, you do need recycling of batteries, rare earths, other finer materials that have to get recycled, which, of course, don't show up in carbon terms, but they are very important from a material availability and material security perspective. So it's a very important debate and discussion, which has to, again, you know, there's one other thing that we talk about is we do need a circularity mission which is active and which takes a comprehensive view of this, which is around material security, around energy security, and around environmental security.
Okay, thank you. And just very briefly, I know that. So, Prabhatji, it's I think you are referring to global cooling price, and so I tell you that we had two winners there, Agree and Daikin. There is a considerable amount of effort that is going on behind the scenes in terms of trying to find out that how much time they will need to actually bring the prototype that was displayed and tested to the market. There may be some product changes, because once I think you start to talk about taking a product to the market, the companies are going to look at, I think, what it will take, what will sell, what will be the operation and maintenance parameter and characteristics. So that work is happening. There is a clean cooling collaborative convening that is happening in the next week, where there is a task force 5X that is going to report, because they are the ones who are in discussions with these two companies. RMI is leading that. And so it's not that I think the prototype can turn into a final launchable product in just a year's time. They have their own timelines that they will take to market and launch it. And we wish that those timelines can be compressed, because we are really trying to look at 4-5x improvement in the room air conditioner. Everybody wants to see those products. So I think work is going on. It is not that everything has, I think, fallen silent, but sometimes these things do take time. There are different players involved. Some people do their work, and then I think the ball is getting passed to some other players who are looking at these things. So that's my response. Thank you very much, Rajat. Again, I thank you for a wonderful opportunity to engage with you and for you to share your findings of this report.
The trouble with having luminaries such as Mr. Gupta and Dr. Kumar on the stage is that the tea gets cold, so we'll have to sort of break for tea.